Hello and welcome to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson. As always, I'm with Pete Lee. And today we're going to talk again about the new constitution in Chile because it is due to be voted on in a referendum or a plebiscite, never quite sure the difference, on the 4th of September. I'm returning myself to Chile shortly after that. I don't know if I will find a peaceful scene or a smouldering wasteland. So today we're going to look at the polling and what the polls show, and how likely approve or reject is to win. So Pete, perhaps you could tell us how it's all looking at the moment.
Well, it's looking more or less, statistically at least, very similar to how it has looked for a number of months. Basically, the tide turned in favour of rejecting the proposed constitution around about in March, when actually Boric ascended the presidency, and has stayed in a fairly narrow couple of bands at a rate of intention to reject between about 43 and 53%. It's floated around there on many polls. There are many polls available. And the approval rate has basically sat between 33 and 42%. So also a fairly narrow band. And we have, in terms of a head-to-head race, base 100, we call it, it's looking 45 to approve and 55 to reject. That's been a pattern that hasn't really shifted lately, which is certainly interesting, as I would say.
And this is despite some measures taken to try and move the needle. One thing that happened was that President Boric threw himself fairly determinedly behind approve, didn't he? It was always assumed that his fortunes would be bound up with approve, more or less, but he could have distanced himself, couldn't he? And he didn't. He rather doubled down.
Yes, we didn't really have any choice insofar as basically the numbers were not changing. They've thrown many things into the mix, trying to change the numbers, and they haven't really changed. The adorable little advertising space, which is called the electoral strip that they have for Chilean elections, is usually an opportunity for some kind of feel-good sentiment. And it was expected that the approval campaign would beat some kind of positive spirit up, but that doesn't seem to have worked as far as we can tell. We're now really coming up to the last fortnight. Will start next week, and opinion polls are not allowed to be published. They can be discussed as far as we can tell, but they can't be formally published during that final 2 weeks. On the Friday prior to the last fortnight, we'll have the last Carem poll. The Carem poll is probably the most keenly watched. Every Sunday night at 8:30 it comes out, usually. It's led by Roberto Isaacson, and those numbers have been very closely watched, haven't really shifted much at all. There was a little bit of a positive movement when Boric gave his annual address at the start of June, but then there was an even bigger backlash as the effects of winter kicked in and the population really felt difficult.
Cold.
Yes. Yes.
And it was a cold winter there.
Yes, with inflation, bad conditions.
So the situation, as I understand it, is now that essentially everybody accepts that there has to be a new constitution. And so those who are pressing for reject are saying reject in order then to like basically restart the process. And given that there's now a track record and lots has been discussed and there's been lots of input, it can be done more quickly this time. Or there's approve to reform. So nobody's saying that there won't be a new constitution, and nobody essentially saying that it's going to be whatever comes out. I mean, that it's going to be the text we've got. Basically, there's going to be a new constitution, and it's either going to be a reformed version of what's being offered now, or it's going to be a new one, right? And I believe everybody on the approve side has now signed up to this idea of approve to reform, right?
Well, certainly the government coalition, or coalitions, if you like, which feature the Apuebo Dignidad coalition, which consists of the Frente Amplio, basically student union movement, student politics, 40-year-olds doing student politics, basically, and the Communist Party, which is a wonderfully sort of conservative Communist Party. It is de-Stalinized, technically speaking, but you wouldn't necessarily know it. They've signed on with what is now calling itself democratic socialism in the sort of Bernie Sanders style. We always had social democracy, but thanks to Bernie Sanders, we now have something called democratic socialism, which seems to be aimed at US tastes. It's the right kind of socialism. And this movement consists of really the centre-left or centrist parties, including the Socialist Party, the Party for Democracy, which was the vehicle of Ricardo Lagos, and also the Christian Democrats, or at least some of the Christian Democrats, some of the Socialists, and some of the Party for Democracy, and the Radical Party as well, because a lot of the voices, particularly those associated with the Constitución period, so the 20 years after the return to electoral democracy in 1990, have come out in favour of rejecting this document. And there's been certainly a lot of smart money is behind rejecting the document just on the basis of its woolliness, I guess.
So it's sounding quite like Brexit, where there were so many establishment voices, like all of them, against Brexit. You start to think, hang on, Brexit's got to win. Actually, it can't be so easy.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's hard to map which side is the Brexit side and which side is the Remain side.
Right, I see what you mean. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, because they both have kind of popular power behind them in a sense. They both have democratic pretenses, but they also both have conservative elements. In some ways, it's been described as woke, the spirit, but I wouldn't say it's the full Northern Hemisphere wokeness. It's a kind of dinky post-Roman Catholic sort of wokeness.
But with a lot of woke vocabulary imported, like they talk about sexual dissidents, don't they, in the Constitution and things like that. So
yeah. So there's a bit of that, but it does have more of a spirit of a kind of kind of social doctrine more than any kind of break with the past. There's quite a lot of continuity in the Apuebo.
We've touched, I think, in the past on the Catholic input into both sides of the debate, haven't we?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not. Yeah. I mean, I suppose approve would be the Brexit side, in that it's kind of a leap into the dark, basically. It's changing the status quo. But okay, it doesn't map directly, certainly. So I think. So here we are. We're coming up to the polls, being closing, as it were, not being allowed to have any more. We're going to be in the dark. And I think you've been following kind of what commentators have been saying in Chile, haven't you?
Yes, well, some of the big names have decided that, save for some extraordinary force majeure sort of happening, there is no statistical hope. It's beyond reach. These would include Thomas Mosciati, who's one of the owners. His family business is Radio Bio Bio, which is a big media organization, also television and websites and so on.
That's right. He's a kind of Chilean Larry King. He's always struck me just because of the way he dresses. He dresses like Larry King, doesn't he? Kind of braces.
Yes.
And
he's sharp as a tack.
He's very good. He's very good. And when the vote, if I'm not mistaken, the referendum that approved the idea that there should be a new constitution won, he announced this as a great revolution, didn't he? But anyway, he's now saying that whatever, this revolution is being at least postponed, and so there's not a hope of approve actually making it past the post.
And he can't see there being enough votes in Santiago to make up for the strong reject sentiment, particularly in the south of the country, which traditionally is conservative. It's deep Chile, whereas I guess it's this very, very populous city, and there's this vision of it as subject to kind of almost local patronage politics. The mayors of the comunas, the municipalities, are very prominent figures, and there's a sense that it is patterned according to its geography, and that there might be a way of mobilizing large numbers of votes for approve in the less well-off areas.
Okay, because I suppose the progressive population in Santiago, which Santiago obviously, like any capital, contains more of than the hinterland, is already more on board with approve, right? Because it belongs to that kind of, let's say, woke as a shorthand for for contemporary progressive politics. Okay, sorry. So in my floundering attempt that I can't seem to stop making to map this onto Brexit, then approve is really remain, because approve is the kind of metropolitan elite, the kind of progressives, and reject is the hinterland, the more kind of traditionalist.
Well, I think there's something to that, in that we're not sure how much purchase there is on the part of the poorer comunas, and the sense that there is some kind of patronage hold on them through the culture of bonuses and bits and pieces of patronage politics involved there. I think there's this imagination of Santiago like it was in the early 1970s, when the political parties, the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, basically had fiefdoms in, recently developing parts of Santiago. And I'm just not sure that's the case. I'm not sure they're going to get it.
It sounds unlikely. I mean, it sounds unlikely. The vote is secret after all. I can't see how this could really work.
Yeah. I think it's more of a romantic vision than anything, and they will need a lot of votes. They'll need to win, well, according not just to Mosciati, but to Pepe Out, longtime congressman and analyst, a very good analyst. They're saying that if it were to win, approve would need to win about 55-45 in Santiago. And that's not looking very likely. It's looking more a slight advantage overall. And they'd need to mobilize over 2 million votes, because it's projected that over 9 million people will vote. need to mobilize, 2.3 million people in Santiago for approve, and it's not looking easy at the moment. So about the brightest ray of light that the approved case has is the opinion poller with the Mori organization, which is an international poller, Ipsos Mori. Marta Lagos, she's associated with the centre left, basically. And in her interpretations, she can see a few more votes, enough votes to not completely give up hope for approve. But even then, she predicts beyond 95% certainty a reject win at this stage. So we just can't see how that needle's going to move.
Strange, isn't it? I mean, this was supposed to be a populist constitution, I mean, in the sense that it's not kind of evidently conservative, I mean, it's always been a question that I've had. Why, since they've had democracy now, why did, Chile's a very poor country, lots of people are very poor, they have democracy, why did they never vote themselves goodies, the poor, why did Chilean governments managed to persist in this really extraordinary fiscal conservatism? I mean, Chile had no national debt until I think about 2 or 3 years ago. Now it's got quite a large one. They've managed to accumulate it fairly quickly. But even so, the measures they took during the pandemic were to make people use their own savings, pension savings, for example, to pay themselves welfare. And you think, how do they get away with this? Why have the poor never voted good stuff for themselves? And now here we have this. Then I thought, well, when they voted, for the new constitution and they voted for Boris, at last they've got it. They've realised that they can, vote themselves goodies. Somehow this progressive, very left-wing, constitutional convention managed to not put anything in the constitution that anybody actually wanted.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know that's really a topic for this particular conversation today, but I mean, it is extraordinary.
Well, I think no. So
anyway, so I sort of took it down this path because we were talking about more technical thing of the sort of polls and the likely results. So perhaps we could just briefly then return to this kind of accord that's been signed by the people you mentioned, by the main, partisan government, the Communist Party, sections of this and that. So essentially, what is it? What are they promising to reform?
Oh,
they're
going to look into the big ticket items, which include the justice system, the political system. So basically, getting rid of the Senate might not be a great idea. Different justice systems for Indigenous identifying peoples and other peoples may not be a great idea. And well, there are 8 items. The general spirit of plurinationality, which is this idea of there being different peoples living in the same country, comes from Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru's working on it, doesn't seem to be a box office item for the wider population. People don't see the analogy there. And this is quite an advanced kind of plurinationalism, I guess, being proposed. Mind you, under the agreement, the original peoples, that is the Indigenous groupings, will have to give their consent to have their right to give their consent on issues that affect them revised. So it's a bit of a lock there.
Right. So it's not a kind of legal lock in the sense that once the constitution's been approved, if it's approved, all the rights in the new constitution don't instantly apply, right? Or they do?
No, they'll be reformed prior to being
right, because it would have to be put into law, even if the constitution were to go through unchanged. It would still have to be codified in law, right, before it's
Yes.
actually applied. So it's more a question of enormous expectations having been aroused amongst indigenous people of the influence they're going to have in the future.
Well, I mean, actually, some of the polling on Indigenous people suggests that they weren't really consulted very closely on much of this at all. And some of the figures involved in the convention were sort of self-appointed community leaders, as often happens in such cases. And yes, certainly some of the polling suggests the Indigenous people aren't that into the Constitution as it stands.
Okay, so they're not that invested in it. Their hopes, they haven't had these huge hopes aroused about Indigenous people going to have a veto on absolutely everything in future.
No, they don't seem to be overly inspired by plurinationalism, this sort of Andean concept. So it may not happen. It may not come to pass, basically because the level of support in the wider community, including among the original peoples, is quite low. So the accord on the part of the governing coalitions to reform, in the case of approval, hasn't shifted opinion much in favour of approval, and reject remains in the box seat.
Okay, and they haven't said exactly how they would reform. They just said they would reform in these areas, and they kind of suggest that the big changes are not a good idea, getting rid of the Senate, whatever. But they've not been too specific about how they would actually reform the Constitution.
No, there's not a lot of clarity on that. I think it's implied that these political parties have their ways of doing things. They call it a cocina, a kitchen, where they cook things up, which of course is a tradition in the centre-left coalitions. And I don't think that's inspired many voters to shift their intention to vote so far.
Okay, and well, we should probably bring this to a close, but do you know, is it certain that it would actually be legal to reform this constitution if it's passed by a referendum? However much people may say in advance, we're only asking you to approve this on the understanding that it will be reformed, but doesn't the law say that if it's passed in a referendum, then that's it?
That's a good question. Well, going back to one of your earlier remarks, the difference between a referendum and a plebiscite, my understanding, at least in English, is the plebiscite is non-binding and a referendum is, technically.
Okay, I was reading Edward Luttwak on this because this American geostrategist who was saying the opposite.
Well, it's very possible that I got it the wrong way around.
Yeah, that he's calling for a plebiscite, in the Donetsk and the Russian occupied areas of Ukraine on their future status. And he was saying that a referendum is something rather vague, and a plebiscite under the Treaty of Versailles has a very clear meaning, and it involves neutral international observers and this and all sorts of safeguards. But anyway, but I don't know what's understood about in Chile, so just ignore all that. It's probably something quite different,
Yes.
And they call it a referendum. Nobody seems to use the word plebiscite. It's always referendum.
Yes.
So whatever it is, plebiscite.
Yes, occasionally you get a plebiscite in English-speaking countries, but usually it is referendum, isn't it?
So yeah. So okay. So anyway, the answer to that is we don't really know actually what the legal situation is, and I suppose somebody's thought of that. Then one does wonder, I mean, maybe this is the great big trap. It gets approved, and then they can say, "Oh, sorry, actually, we can't legally do anything about it." Perhaps we should have to look into that for next time.
We should study up a bit more. Of course, the constitutional courts are very important in Chile and in Latin America in general, and they will be involved in some way in basically doing the bona fides of the implementation of any new constitution and indeed any reform process
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we've probably said as much as we're going to say for today about the subject of this constitution. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to produce more interesting material soon here on Chile Talk.
Great to see you.